My API folder just contains a README. So first of all, I will open a new terminal window. I'll change directory and I'll use yarn to initialize the package. I'm using Express to build my API. So first of all, I'll install that with npm. Then I will create an entry file for my API. In this case, I'll call it server.js. Inside my server file, I'm going to import Express. I'm then going to create an app which is going to use Express. And then my app is going to use just the bare root. And it's going to have a function that will accept the request and the response and respond just with a text snippet saying this is working. Next, I'll have my server listen on port 3001 because my next application is listening on port 3000. And I will log to the console once the server has started to tell me where it's listening. So let's use Node to start our server and test if it's working. We've successfully logged to the console, which is great. Now to test the API, I'll use a client, in this case Insomnia, localhost 3001. I'll send a request and I get a response with a text snippet, this is working. While the server is running, if I update the code and then trigger a request to the API, we'll see that there's no change. We need to restart the server after every change we make to the code. To stop us having to do that, I'm going to use a package called nodemon, which restarts the server every time that there's a change to the files. I'll add a scripts block to my package.json file, and I will just add a dev script. In this case, it's nodemon server.js. Back in my terminal, I'll run npm run dev, and then I'll see that my server is still saying this is still working. Let's test that in Insomnia. And then let's try updating the text without restarting the server. You see, when I save this file, nodemon will automatically restart the server. So when I get back to my Insomnia client, I'll get the response I wanted. This catchphrase application gets an image from an API. In this case, it's using the Phil Murray API, which gives an image of Bill Murray based on the size of image we want. And it accepts a guess, and this guess will be related to the image in some way. We want to be able to build the backend API that's going to serve this. First task will be to create the API that will respond with the image source so that we can stop this being hard-coded. Okay, so let's use our API to send back something useful. We have our image path, which is philmurray.com/400/400. Remembering those numbers mean the image size. So let's send that text back, but with a different image size, say 400 by 500. Let's test that that works back with Insomnia. Super. It's normally a good idea to send JSON, so let's send a JSON object instead with the key image source and with the value with the string that we've just created. Cool, that's working. We want to refactor our fetch new image function so that it will use our API rather than having a hard-coded value. We're going to create a util function to be able to do that. What's next is server-side rendered on the first paint, and then client-side. We need to be able to use a function that's going to work in both settings. In this case, we'll use isometric unfetch, which allows us to use node fetch when we are in server side and the browser fetch when we are rendering from the client. Up this custom client component from Kenzie Dodds. We have a function that takes in the endpoint and also takes in an object which may have a body property and a custom config. It defaults to an empty object if it's not there. We set up some headers, in this case just content type application JSON, and then the config. If there is a body, the method is set to post. If there's not, it's set to get. If there's any custom config, that gets spread over the object. And then for the headers, we have our header, content type application JSON from before, and any custom headers that are passed in. If there's a body, the body gets appended to the config object. And then we use our fetch command. We fetch our API, passing through our endpoint, which we got from the function call, and the config object that we've compiled. If the status is 401, we just return. Otherwise, we await the data to be JSONed. If the response is okay, then we return the data. Otherwise, we reject the promise. Let's export our function from our utils function and then import it to our client side. Now, what we don't need to do with next is include this React statement. So let's just get rid of it. And then let's refactor our fetch new image function. What we want to do here is we want to make it an async function. We then are going to set a path variable to be await the client. We don't need an endpoint, so we'll pass through an empty string. And then we'll get the data and we'll get the image source. We'll set the image source, which is a use state that we've destructured above. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that our app is being served on port 3000, while our API is being served on port 3001. This is a cross-origin problem that we need to fix. We do that by installing the cores module from npm into our API. We then require the module and we get our app to use it. When we've done that, NodeMon will restart as we expect. And so we're there. We can now use our API. We get new image. We'll see we get a different image than we had before because this is the 400 by 500 image that's being served. We can change these variables to be maybe 200 by 200 and fetch the new image. And my API is serving a single URL that's hard-coded. I can update and change. I want to be able to serve files from my public folder. Here, I've got some images collected already. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an express helper. So I'm going to do app.use. I want to do this on my base root. And say on my base root, I want express.static, and the folder I care about is public. Now I can navigate to port 3001/image1, which is without JPEG, and here's one of the images that I have. So what I would like to do is instead of getting Bill Murray and this hard-coded URL, I would like to get a random image from this directory. Well, the first thing I'd like to do, because I'm going to access something from the file system to select a random file, I'm going to use the file system library from Node. And then I need to know what my base URL is. And in this case, I'm going to hard code that as my localhost 3001. That's where my API is, and my images directory, which is /public. Great. On my images route, I want to, in some way, return a random image. So how about we have a function, which is to select, which is just called random image. And all that does is it is return a string. So in this case, if I just remove the string there and instead have random image, nothing should have changed. Change this to 200 by 400. We get a new image. Cool. So we need to get a string that's representing the image in our public folder. So how are we going to do that? Well, first of all, I'm going to get all of the files that are in that directory. So I'm going to use the fs method, read dir sync, and I'm going to use the __ dir name, which gets my directory, and then the image directory, which we've defined above. Then I'm going to choose a file. So my chosen file is going to be files, which is an array, and I want the math.floor of, well, what I want math, I want a random file somewhere based on the file's length. Okay. And so instead of returning Phil Murray, I want to return the base URL. I'm going to use a template literal for this. And then / the chosen file. So hopefully now, when I press my get new image, I'll get one of the images from my directory. I'm going to add a new route in my Express application, which is going to be called guess. And for the moment, its handler is just going to be a function that takes the request and the response and just sends back the body from the request. So I'm going to test that. I'm going to send a JSON object, and you see that I've sent it to the right route, but there's no body returned for the response in my client. And if I log that out to the console, it's also undefined in the console. I've got the right JSON, I've got the right headers. What's the problem? Well, by default, Express doesn't know to parse JSON. We have to tell it explicitly. Previously, we've done that with body parser, but that's now built into Express. So we can use app.use express.json. And when I send a request, it appears in my client and in the console. So what do I want this route to do? Well, I'm going to send a guess, and I'm going to send the image that my guess is going to be related to. And it's going to be a URL because that's what the client's going to know about. So I've got my test, and that's definitely going through. So I'm going to need some data. So I have these 5 images, and they're related to catchphrases. And so for each image, I need an answer. So apple pie, baseline, wish upon a star. So I've got an array of objects here. So I'm going to import those. So const answers is require, and then those answers. And then I'm going to change my function, that's my handler. So I got the guess from the body, so request.body.guess. And I'm going to need the image. Now, the image is the last part of that URL. So I'm going to do request.body.image. I'm going to split that on the forward slashes, and I just want the very last bit. So I'm going to pop off the end of that array. And that will be my image5.jpg. And then I want the result. And the result comes when I test the guess with the guess and the image. Well, I need to write that function. So I'm going to do function test guess, and I'm going to pass in the guess and the image as I did earlier on the call. What I'm going to do is I'm going to filter the answers data, and I'm going to filter it based on each answer and to see whether or not the image in that answer, so answer.image, is equal to the image that's passing through. Now that gives me an array, so I only want the 0th term of that, and then I want to get the answer. So my answer is now 4-wheel drive, and I'm going to return if my guess equals my answer. But I also don't care about whether or not the case is right, so let's do some cursor magic and change to uppercase, to lowercase rather. So dot to lowercase, and also I don't care if there are spaces, so let's replace any spaces that there are. Let's just get rid of them with an empty string. So that'll return true or false. So I'm now going to change my body while I'm sending back. So instead of sending back just text, I'm going to send a JSON object, so res.json. And what this JSON object is going to be is going to depend on the result. So if the result is true, so the guess equals the image or the answer, then I send back a message that says, yay, well done, and a success flag that's going to be set to true. If, however, the result is false, then I'm going to send back a message like better luck next time, check your spelling, and send back a success flag of false. And we're done. So the only thing left to do now is to check and test whether or not it works. So we send back this, well, hopefully it's wrong. Woo! And then we know our real answer should be 4-wheel drive, so let's test that, and it is. And we're done. I'm going to create some custom middleware for my Express application. We're already using cores and Express.json in our application. I'm going to create an authentication layer. So utils.auth.js is where I'm going to create it. I'm going to create a function. Now, every middleware function Express takes 3 parameters: the request, the response, and next. Middleware will check something on the request or add something to the response, and then when it's finished, it will call next. I'm going to check whether or not there's an XAPI key header. So first of all, I'll check if the header doesn't exist. I'm going to send an early response back. And equally, if the header does exist, but it's incorrect, I'm going to send an early response back. So if not XAPI request.header, XAPI key, header is a helper function that Express adds to the request to check the headers. So if that header doesn't exist, or if the header does exist, but it's not equal to our test API key, Normally, for security, these should be environment variables that we would use .n for something similar to store rather than the code like this. In this instance, I'm just hard coding it. So if either of those cases are true, then I'm going to set the status of the response to 401, which means unauthorized. And then I'll return a JSON object, which will just say that the key was invalid. Otherwise, if everything was fine there, I'll call the next function, which just tells Express to keep going through the chain of middleware and do the next one. So I'll export this function, module export.auth, and then I'll import it into my server file. So const auth equals require.utils.auth. And now I need to think about where am I going to use my authentication middleware. Well, actually, I don't want it on this images. I want that just to be a normal get that can be managed by others. But I do want it here, so I just chain it there. And I do want it on my guest as well. Now I can chain as many middleware as I want here until the response handler actually sends a response. And now it's time to test it. So if I test it now, you see I get an invalid API key, and that's the example when there is no XAPI key header. Let's add an XAPI key header and call it test, which is also incorrect. Great, that fails as well. Our real key is test API key, and we test that, it comes back as we expect. I have a test route, and all it's doing is throwing a new error. So if I visit that within my client, I get error, my error message, my stack trace, and my status of 500. If, however, this was an asynchronous request handler, instead of having my error message resolved to the client, it will not be passed back. Express, by default, does not handle asynchronous errors. We need to handle those ourselves. And there are a number of ways to do that. The first is we can use the optional next parameter inside of the request handler. And instead of throwing the new error, we can return next with the error. This provides the same developer experience with the error and the status message. But we need to remember to do this at every point where our application could possibly throw an error. Another approach is to use try-catch, where we can have any amount of errors thrown within our try, and when we catch an error, we pass that to our next handler, and again, we get the same developer experience. I prefer to use a library like express async errors. That means I don't have to include try-catch in all the places where I want to cover asynchronous errors, and I don't have to use the next handler. That gives me the same user experience where I have the error message, the stack trace, and the 500 status error. However, that experience isn't as nice as I would like it to be. The error message is ugly, and I'd like to be able to have more control over my error handling. So I've got this error handling middleware. The only difference in error handling middleware is it has an error as its first parameter, as well as the request, the response, and next. The first thing I do is check whether or not res.headerSent exists. If it does, it means that the response has already been sent, so I call next error because I don't need to do anything. Otherwise, I set the status to 500, and I start making this JSON object I'm going to pass back with the error message, and if I'm in production, I'm going to send back nothing else. However, if I'm not in production, I'm going to send back the stack and the errors of the stack trace. So now I need to use this. The first thing is I'll import it. And then I need to tell my app to use it. It's important that the last thing I ask my app to use before I call listen. So app use error handling. Now when I get an error, I get a much nicer and cleaner experience. I get a JSON object, which is easier to parse than the plain text that was being sent back before. And if I was in production, I wouldn't get the stack trace at all. If I just change this Boolean, we can see that I would just get the message. I wouldn't get anything else. Whereas if I'm not in production, I get a helpful message and the stack. To be able to authenticate within our application, we're first going to set up an API within Auth0. Once you've signed up for an account, we're going to go to APIs. We're going to click on Create API, and we're going to give it a name. In this case, I'm going to call it catchphrase. My identifier is going to be in the form of URL, even if it's not one that we own. In this case, I'm going to use catchphrase.app and record that for later. And the signing algorithm I'm going to use is RS256. Now, once that's been created, we want to note down this identifier. Later on, that's going to be referred to as the audience. When we created the API, an application was also created to go alongside it called the catchphrase test application. Clicking in here, there are two details that we're going to need to note for later. Those two details are the client ID and the client secret. Now, this client secret, you should keep secret. And so I'm going to reveal it here, and you'll see it's just a whole load of characters. But before I publish this tutorial, I'm going to refresh this key so we won't be able to use it. Now, having recorded the client ID, the client secret, and the identifier, we're ready to start authenticating users of our API. Having set up Auth0, we're now going to prepare our project. I'm going to install some dependencies. First of all, I'll install the Express JWT, which is the middleware for Express that deals with JSON Web Tokens. The second library I'll install is jwks-rsa, which is a library to retrieve RSA signing keys from a JSON Web Key Set endpoint, which is provided to us by Auth0. And I'll also install .env, which is a library that allows us to access environment variables securely so that we don't have to store them in our source code. Once we've done that, we'll start our API. Now that we have our dependencies installed, we're going to create a new file called auth.js in our utils folder. And in that, we're going to create a middleware function called checkJWT, which is going to check the JSON Web Token that's provided to us on our request. In that file, we'll require the two libraries, which we just installed. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a checkJWT function, check the JSON Web Token. And we're going to use the middleware that we imported up above. We're going to pass an options object to that middleware. The first option is the secret, which we're going to generate from using the JWKS-RSA library. Using the exposed function express JWT secret. We're going to cache that secret. We're going to rate limit it. We're going to say you can request 5 times per minute. And we're going to use a URI that's provided to us by Auth0. We have to define the audience. In this case, we're going to use the one that we defined in the last video, and the issuer. Again, that's provided to us by Auth0. The algorithm we're going to use is RS256, as we declared earlier, and we are going to export that function to be able to be used in our application. So, back in our server.js file, we are going to import the function that we've just created. Check JWT, which we're going to import from our utils directory and specifically our auth file. I currently have one unprotected and public route /test. Hitting this will send a response back that says this is a test. I'm going to copy this route and change it to test-auth. And I'm going to add in the middleware that is going to check and test whether or not the request has passed a valid JWT JSON Web Token. I add that anywhere in the chain. So let's follow the logic. We have a route that's being hit, test-auth. We have some middleware, which is checking the JWT. And if this fails, if it's an invalid JSON Web Token, then we'll return a 401 error unauthenticated. Otherwise, we'll continue, we'll process the request, and we'll say, this is a test. I'll now open my favorite API tester, Insomnia, and I'll go to 3001 test, send a request, and I say get a 200 OK with this is a test. If I send a test request to test-auth, I get a 401 unauthorized, and I'm told that there is no authorization token found. Lastly, if I do authenticate my request using a bearer token with some random text rather than a valid token, I'll be told that my JWT is malformed, and it will also fail on a 401. Now we need to be able to get a valid JSON token to be able to access and use our API. Firstly, I'll install another library called request, which will allow our Express server to be able to carry out requests itself. I'll import that into my server file, and then we'll be able to use it. The next thing I want to do is to open up my .env file. In my .env file, I'll add two pieces of information, my auth0 client ID and my auth0 client secret. The reason we use .env files is so that we don't accidentally commit our credentials to source control where they're vulnerable. But if I check my git status, I can see that my .n file is indeed in the untracked files. I want to stop that from happening. I'm going to add a .getignore file, and to that .getignore file, I'm going to add .n. Now, when I check my status again, you'll see that the .getignore is there, but the .env isn't. When these files are committed and pushed to my repository, no one will be able to accidentally commit the .env file in the future. Back in my server.js file, I want to make those environment variables available. So I'm going to require .env and use the exposed function .config, which will make all of that file, that .env file, available in my process.env variables. So I'm now going to expose a route that's going to allow me to get a token to be able to use in my future requests. I'm going to call that route getToken. So app.get getToken is going to be a function that is going to take a request and a response as usual, and is going to use the request library to be able to fetch a new token. So the request library takes an options object. First, we'll define the method, which in this case will be post, and the URL, which is our auth0 token provider, which they give us. We're going to pass a header, and that header is going to be the content type, which is application/xwww form URL encoded, because we're going to pass a form. And in that form, we are going to define what we want. We've got our grant type, which is client credentials. There are several available: authorization code, password, refresh token, but the one we're going to use is client credentials. And we need to pass through the client ID, which is available from our process.env on auth0_client_ID that we defined in our .env file. Client secret similarly, and our audience, which is the URL that we defined our API in auth0 earlier. The second thing that our request function takes is the callback function. And a callback function takes 3 parameters: error, response, and body. So if there is an error, let's set the status to 400 and send the error back. Otherwise, let's just return the body. And that body will contain the access token that we're going to use. Let's test that. Let's start up my server. I'm back in Insomnia and I'm testing my test-auth route. I can see if I pass a nonsense token in, I get a 401 unauthorized. If instead I pass in get-token, we can see I get an access token. I'm told it's a token type bearer and it expires in 86,400 seconds, which is 1 day. I'll copy this token and replace the contents of the token field. And now I'll test my test-auth route. The middleware will check the JWT and it passes. And I get this is a test. So now we've secured our route. You need a JWT. We've gathered the JWT. The server is able to authenticate itself. And next we have to think about how we can securely allow clients to be able to authenticate it. We're going to install a middleware called Express File Upload that's going to help us with our upload by parsing our files properly and attaching some information and methods to our file that will help us deal with it. So the first thing we'll do is import our middleware. So const file upload equals require express file upload. Next, we'll have our application use that middleware. So once the app's been declared in our chain here, we'll app.useFileUpload, which will intercept any binary upload and attach extra information and functions. Next, we'll add a route to be able to upload our files. It's going to be a post route, and it's going to have the path of upload-image. We'll then add the request and response function that's going to receive the request and response and deal with them. Great. Let's start building our function. So let's introduce a try catch and let's fill out the unhappy path first. So if there is an error, let's log that error to the console and then let's send that back to the client. So return the response with a status code of 500 because there's an error and sending the error as well. So now for the happy path. So we're going to fill out our try. And the first thing we want to check is whether or not there is a file. So in a multi-part form, like we're going to use, the binary files will be attached to the files property of the request. So first of all, we check whether or not that's present. And even if that object is present, we want to make sure that it's not empty. So to test for that, we're going to get the keys from the object. And we're going to get the length of that array. And we're going to make sure that that doesn't equal 0. So if either of those two things are true, we're going to throw a new error, which is going to be an object, which is going to have a message, and the message is going to say no images uploaded. Now that we know that our files object is not empty, let's get the file that we want. So it's an image, so let's let image equal rec.files.imagefile. And that corresponds to the ID that our file would have in the form, or the key that we identify it with. So once we've got that image, we're going to use the mv, or the move function, that our middleware has attached to that file. And that accepts the path that we want to move it to. So we're going to move it to .public and add its name, and a callback function. The callback function accepts the error. So if there is an error, we're going to throw it. Otherwise, we'll respond just with an object with a message which just says file uploaded. Now to test that worked. Use your API tester of choice. Mine is Insomnia on the Mac. And I'm going to post to localhost 3001 and to the route /upload image. So the first thing to check is our unhappy route. So if we don't send an image object, we are getting back the no files were uploaded message that we wrote earlier. Next, we'll set our body type to be a multi-part form, which will have a key value pairing going on. So I'm going to set my name to image file, like I'm expecting in my code, and I'm going to attach a file. So I'm going to choose the file from my desktop, which is just going to be a screenshot, and select that file and send the post request. And now you can see the file was uploaded, and checking my file system, it's uploaded there too.